Brendan Dassey trial transcript day 4, page 52, continuing with Dr. Eisenberg's testimony. And the board then will determine whether or not you are fit or ready to sit for an all-day examination, the morning of which involves a written examination, and the afternoon is a hands-on practical examination involving the examination, analysis, and interpretation of bone in many different conditions, much of it fragmentary. What, if you would, are some of the key positions or responsibilities that you have held in the field of forensic anthropology that assist you in performing that work? Notably, I was a consultant for the Office of Chief Medical Examiner of New York from 1986 until 1993, when I moved to Wisconsin to take the position as program coordinator for the Wisconsin Historical Society's Burial Sites Preservation Program, where I have occasion on a fairly regular basis to examine and identify human bone, animal bone, and so on for law enforcement. Most of that bone comes from archaeological or older context. I also, since 1995, have been a member of a federal disaster team, a regional federal disaster team that goes by the acronym DMORT, D-M-O-R-T, which stands for Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team. And in that capacity, I've been deployed on several occasions, the earliest of which was in 1999 at the site of an Amtrak train crash in Bourbonnais, Illinois, where there were fatalities primarily as a result of a fire in the sleeping car of that train. After that, I was asked immediately after the World Trade Center attacks on September 11 to be one of the first teams to respond to the East Coast disaster, where I had occasion to work to identify and examine fragmentary human and non-human remains. Many of those remains had been exposed to considerable trauma and burning, as you might imagine. And more recently, in September of 2005, I had occasion to be called or deployed down to Mississippi after the Hurricane Katrina, and at the same time, Hurricane Rita came through to help identify remains of individuals who died during the hurricane, as well as collecting and identifying skeletonized human remains that had been washed out of cemeteries, in-ground burials, as well as above-ground mausoleums. All right, and how long have you held your board certification in the field of forensic anthropology? For 10 years now. I received that certification in 1997. In addition to that, DMORT, appointments and status, have you received any other noteworthy appointments? Yes, I have. Are you talking about memberships, or if you can clarify for me? Sure. In the field of forensic anthropology, there are some appointments or memberships of groups that you find particularly pertinent that assist you in conducting your work? Understood. Thank you for that clarification. From 1999 through 2005, I was an elected board member for the American Board of Forensic Anthropology, and for the last 3 years of that 6-year appointment, I was elected secretary of that board. Do you have any particularly, well, let's ask it this way. Do you have any publications in the field of forensic anthropology? Yes, I do, sir. Tell us about those. Some of those publications are jointly authored by others with whom I've worked. They appear in what is the preeminent journal in the field of forensic anthropology, which is called the Journal of Forensic Sciences. I also have a number of other publications that span the fields of archaeology and forensic anthropology that are specifically focused on human remains and the identification of human remains. I'm going to have Investigator Wiegert show you Exhibit 199. Yes, sir. All right, and do you recognize that? Yes, I do. It's my resume, or what is referred to in the academic field as a curriculum vitae, a history of your accomplishments, if you will. And did you prepare that? Yes, sir, I did. Is that a true and accurate summary of your educational training and professional experience in both forensic anthropology and otherwise? Yes, sir, it is. Very good. All right, doctor. Directing your attention then to this particular case, when did you become involved in this case? I initially became involved in this case through a telephone message that was left for me on November 9 of 2005. What were you asked to do? The contents of that voicemail message that was left for me was that some remains had been found, and I was asked to examine those remains that had been left for me in a sealed container in my office awaiting my return. At the time I received that call on November 9, I was in transit back to Madison from a national conference on missing persons in Denver, Colorado. I was one of several people at the time who was representing the state of Wisconsin at that conference. And what were the tasks? What specifically were you asked to do by law enforcement? I was asked to examine items that were in a flat cardboard box that had been sealed with evidence tape when I received it. And I was asked to identify if any of the items in that box were of human origin. I'm going to have Investigator Wiegert bring you a series of photographs. Thank you. I believe the first photograph there is marked as Exhibit 183. We'll have that displayed on the screen in a moment. Let me ask, do you recognize that? Yes, sir, I do. All right, and what is depicted in Exhibit 183? I, along with other investigators, are sorting through material that was collected from the Stephen Avery property, and we are looking through this material with the objective of looking for any human remains or other objects of significance that had been collected from that property. Tell us a little bit about that process that's depicted in the photograph, if you would. The process that I used to examine all the material presented for me for examination is a fairly systematic process, and a process that every forensic anthropologist goes through. And the first thing that I do, and the major contribution that any forensic anthropologist can make to an investigation like this, involves the recognition and sorting of human bone, and in this case, burned human bone, from burned and unburned non-human bone. The next step in that process is looking at the burned human bone that has been sorted out to see if there are any diagnostic or telling attributes or traits on any of those fragments that can tell the anthropologist something about whose remains you are looking at. The next step in the process is taking those diagnostic fragments and developing what we call in the field a biological profile. And what that means is determining, if you can, the age of the individual, the sex of the individual, the stature of the individual, how tall they were, and the ancestry if possible. Also, critically important is to determine if there's anything else you can tell from those diagnostic fragments, including the presence of any trauma to those remains that may have been sustained or may have occurred in what we call the ante-mortem interval, the interval before death, the perimortem interval, Perimortem, and that simply means at or near the time of death, or in the post-mortem interval, during a time after death. And the other activity that I undertook with these burn fragments was trying to see if I could refit any of those fragments with each other. Very well. What is the next photograph? I believe would be Exhibit 184. Is that correct? That is correct. And what is depicted in Exhibit 184? That is a photo of myself and some other investigators looking through additional material that had been collected for the presence of any human remains, bone fragments, dental structures, or anything else that we considered significant. All right, and the next photograph, Exhibit 185, I believe, that is correct. All right. Exhibit 185 represents the interior and contents of the box that was initially left for me for examination on November 5 of 2005, that I had the opportunity to initially examine the following day on November 10, 2005. All right, let's stop there for a moment and talk a little bit about the box and its contents. What were the condition of those contents? The bones that you, or fragments is probably the best way of describing it. Well, when you looked at them. As I look in this photograph and on the screen, what I can see and what I saw at the time are fragments of material, some of which were clearly identifiable as human bone fragments that were heavily burned and in some cases calcined. Some of the bone that you see that looks white in color is what we call calcined. It represents bone that has lost its moisture content, because all bone has fat content, has moisture content, has blood running through it, and when it's exposed to heat, and considerable heat, that moisture and the blood and the fatty tissue, the marrow, will all dry up, and the bone itself, the organic content of the bone, what makes bone, also disappears. And the bone, calcined bone, becomes almost like a piece of porcelain or ceramic, in that if you knock it against a table, it will sound very much like a piece of porcelain. In terms of as a forensic anthropologist who often is called upon to attempt identification of remains, are there varying levels or degrees of destruction that you forensic anthropologists utilize to categorize exactly the condition of the items you're examining? We do. In 1996, there was a very basic scheme developed by a forensic anthropologist from Texas and a colleague of his. It's known as the Crowe-Glassman scales. Crow-Glassman, Glassman. And what Crow and Glassman did was set up a 5-stage or 5-level scheme, if you will, that talks about increasing levels of burning on bone. Level 1, for example, would involve a body that was charred but would be visually recognizable to people who knew him or her, or to family members. And that starts with level 1 and goes up to level 5. And increasingly, there is more destruction to the body. The body then becomes unrecognizable. And level 5 depicts the body in a state that is primarily only recognizable because of its fragmentation and burning to forensic anthropologists and forensic dentists. And in this particular case, what was the level or condition of the fragments you were asked to examine? In my opinion, the fragments that I was asked to examine, that I identified as burned human fragments, would have fallen into that last category, the most destructive category, level 5. All right, is this what is sometimes referred to as the ultimate level of destruction? By some authors, yes, it is. In this particular case, of all the fragments that you examined, were you able to locate any human skull fragments? Yes, sir, I was able to. Approximately how many fragments were you able to locate? Or identify. There were approximately 58 fragments that were identifiable as human and diagnostic, to the point that I could say these fragments came from a human skull. In terms of how much of a human skull was represented by those 58 fragments, rough estimate if you have one. A rough estimate, I would say perhaps a quarter, and that may be an exaggerated statement. Could be less, it could be less. All right, doctor, let's begin with some of your conclusions or findings. First, based on your examination of the bones recovered from the pit behind the garage of Stephen Avery, did you find evidence of human remains? Yes, sir, I did. And were you able to identify the relative age of the person whose remains you examined? Yes, I was able to determine a relative age of the person whose remains I did examine. Tell us about that, please. There are many techniques that forensic anthropologists use to determine someone's age. When remains are unrecognizable and either too decomposed or skeletonized for a traditional autopsy. In this case, because of the fragmentation and burning, many of the characteristics or traits we look at to make that determination were not present or not recognizable because of the condition of the remains. But there were several areas of the face, skull, if you will, and what we call the postcranial remains, the remains below the skull, that we were able to help me come to a determination of an approximate age of the individual whose remains I examined. And what was that? My determination was that the remains of the individual I examined were no older than 30 to 35 years of age. All right, if you could explain for us that range, that step you just gave us, 30 to 35, in terms of the field of forensic anthropology and identification, what does that mean or represent? Well, what that means to all of us really is that once as we age, and at about the age of about 30 to 35, our body starts showing signs of wear, and that wear is degenerative. In other words, it's something that happens with use as we use our bodies to do lots of things. And that's at about the time when forensic anthropologists can pick up signs of arthritis, or what's sometimes called degenerative joint disease, on many parts of the skeleton. What I did note from the joint surfaces that were present to examine was that there were absolutely no traces of the belongings of arthritis, which allowed me to cap the age as no older than 30 to 35 years. I also had an opportunity in looking at the skull fragments, and some of those fragments had suture lines. When we think of the skull, we may think of a ball-like structure or a sphere-like structure, but in fact, our skulls are made up of many joint bones that come together at what are kind of joints. They're not like a shoulder joint or a hip joint, but it's where the bones fit together, almost like teeth in a zipper in some places, and those openings called sutures, where those bones come together, had not fused, which is something you typically see as in someone who's much older than 30 to 35. All right, so in effect then, you're telling us these are the remains of a person who's under age 30? Yes, sir. All right, were you able to determine the sex of the person by the remains which were recovered? Yes, sir, I was. And what did you conclude? Based on examining certain diagnostic fragments, I was able to determine that the remains presented to me for analysis, those fragmented and burned remains, were those of a female. All right, I'm going to have the next exhibit. I believe the photograph is in front of you. It should be Exhibit 168. That's correct, sir.